Welcome to Lesson Learned, the official podcast of the Curriculum Instruction and Assessment Department at Midwestern Intermediate Unit 4. I'm your host, Shannon Smith, and today we're diving into mental health literacy, common language, and understanding. Today's episode is a powerful one. We'll explore what mental health literacy is, why it's essential, and how schools can take action to build a healthier, more supportive environment for students and staff alike. Education is always evolving, and as educators, leaders, and advocates, we must do more than keep pace. We must drive progress. In every episode of our podcast series on school climate, we engage with experts, practitioners, and innovators to address the key issues shaping our schools. We're committed to exploring the topics that truly impact students, teachers, and communities. So grab your go-to beverage, settle in, and get ready for a conversation that just might change the way you think about education. Once again, I'm excited to welcome back safety and security expert for our K-12 schools, Dr. Melissa Nelson, and author and mental health expert, Dr. Susan Tarasevich.
Well, thank you, Shannon. It's so nice to be back with you.
It's terrific to be back.
So if you wouldn't mind, how does your area of expertise really lend itself to developing this mental health literacy and common language?
Well, Shannon, as I mentioned in the first episode of this podcast series, my background and where I sit now brings together experiences in places where I worked as a clinician, like Western Psychiatric Institute and Clinic, on both in the emergency room and then on one of their mobile crisis teams, coupled together with the background and experiences and training and schooling, formal schooling that I've received in K-12 situations. So today, when we're talking about mental health literacy specifically, the lens through which I'm seeing this really started during my doctoral work at the University of Pittsburgh, when I wanted to explore what educators knew about specific mental health topics that they were encountering with the children and adolescents in their classrooms. So that's when I'm sharing my answers today. It's really coming from the lens of experience and background and training, along with the work that I've done at the University of Pittsburgh.
You know, just to piggyback on what Melissa said, my expertise really comes from 30 years of working with schools and mental health, drug and alcohol systems, and really trying to help educators feel some level of comfort in this, having the knowledge base and the skills to respond proactively and I think with empathy to students and families that are struggling with a mental health diagnosis. But also I think we have to recognize that part of what we do is promote mental wellness and behavioral health wellness. So I've been a teacher, a counselor, an administrator, and been working in student assistance and positive behavioral intervention and support and a whole variety of things now for some decades. And so the framework that I bring is let's understand the brain and let's come up with a common language for talking about behavior and behavioral health issues.
Well, let's get this conversation started. I think for our listeners, we first need to establish what mental health literacy is and why it is important for schools to actively develop it among students and staff, especially if we are taking into consideration the barriers preventing a full understanding of mental health literacy and wellness amongst our educators and students.
So Shannon, the term mental health literacy has a very specific definition that was developed by Dr. Stan Kuchar from the University of British Columbia in Canada. Dr. Kuchar is one of the world's foremost experts in this area, and specifically understanding mental health literacy and how we develop that within K-12 settings. So Dr. Kuchar takes the definition of mental health literacy that was grounded in the terminology health literacy, but now he's applying it to what it means from a mental health perspective. So the very specific definition that mental health literacy has, it has 4 components to it. One, when we have mental health literacy, we understand how to obtain and maintain positive mental health. 2, when we have mental health literacy, we understand mental disorders and their treatments. And an offshoot of that is knowing the difference between typical life responses and then when we start becoming unwell or struggling and having mental health issues and mental illness. 3, when we have mental health literacy, we understand how to decrease stigma around mental health issues, struggles, and disorders. And 4, when we have mental health literacy, we understand how to enhance help-seeking efficacy, understanding and knowing when, where to get help, how to develop skill sets and competencies designed to improve mental health care and self-management capabilities. Now, when we hear that definition of mental health literacy, what is so important about the work that Dr. Kuchar and his team at the University of British Columbia have done is that he's taken that terminology and all of the research and wonderful work he's done, and he's applied it to the context of K-12 settings. So what do all of the adults within a school system need to know and understand as far as increasing their mental health literacy so that they can then not only support themselves, but especially when we send our students and children on helping them obtain and maintain positive mental health, knowing enough, at least even cursory, about the difference between what typical life responses look like as opposed to someone who is struggling with mental health issues and then perhaps even mental disorder or mental illness. What are all of the ways that in schools we can decrease stigmas around children and adolescents who might be struggling in the area of mental health and mental illness? And then what are also ways that we can help children, adolescents, and their families seek help? Do we know where we can refer children? So it has this very specific meaning, and the work that Dr. Kuchar has done has really established for all of us in K-12 a very wonderful framework for how we can think about what our responsibilities are as educators, and also then what they are not as educators. Because one of the things that naturally comes out of this is that while it's important to have good mental health literacy or knowledge or understanding around mental disorders and their treatments, it's not our job to treat children in our schools. But what we can do as educators in our schools is to at least have a cursory knowledge to know when a child's struggling enough to say to their family, hey, we're concerned about your child. We're noticing some things that might be indicating that they are struggling or they aren't doing well right now from a mental health perspective, so let us refer you to the appropriate places and to the appropriate people.
I want to pick up on what you said about educators understanding that they don't have to fix this. Mm-hmm. That really recognizing what those learning barriers are, that they could or could not be a mental health or a behavioral health concern, is everything. Because I don't want a teacher thinking that if they're seeing a certain cluster of behaviors that child has a mental health diagnosis like bipolar disorder. That's not their job, that's not their role. But really being with a child and maybe even with their family in recognizing that we can rule this out or rule it in. And that's one of the things that we really try to have educators understand in our student assistance training. And in Pennsylvania, we have teams of people who are highly trained to walk with students and families and connect them with the best resources should there be a mental health need. So much of that literacy goes into knowing what I can and what I cannot do. And I always kick it upstairs and refer it, even when I'm not sure.
I think it's so important, too, that as we're looking at building this mental health literacy, that once again, it's another means for us to work on prevention rather than reaction. And up to this point, the trend seems to be, let's prepare for a crisis or a disaster, or let's prepare to react to a situation rather than finding the supports that might be necessary to really create that balance that we need. So as we move towards building a common language, how does mental health literacy address the stigma around discussing mental health in schools? And how does a lack of it lead to misconceptions, misdiagnoses, and insufficient support for students?
I think humanity has always stigmatized that which it did not understand. And so we make up, phrases that really reflect a lack of awareness of the brain. And over the last 20 years, wow, our knowledge of what's happening in the brain has just exploded. And I think that's a place for really building that mental health literacy. I hear all the time, a teacher says, well, you know what, that child just needs to pick themselves up by their bootstraps and try harder, or snap out of it, or ways of minimizing and diminishing it. Just cheer up, or you're being too dramatic. Those really do build the stigma and really create that sense of shame or guilt, because so often the issues that emerge that are behavioral health in nature are coming from brain chemistry, that are coming from the way my brain was formed in my early years. Stigma prevents us from accepting care and services because we're crazy, or we're attention seeking, or we're weak. And the opposite is really true. And that's what I say to kids all the time. It takes a lot of courage to speak your truth. And I know someone who can really help you with this. Blaming, shaming, all of those things perpetuate the myths and misinformation around mental health and mental illness. People believe that once you have a mental illness, you never get better. And the opposite is true.
So when we are thinking specifically about mental health area and that definition that talks about understanding what typical life experiences are and what disorders look like, and then addressing stigma, and how we then discuss mental health struggles in schools or mental health wellness in schools, what that is all really grounded in is knowing facts, knowing actual facts, listening to experts, looking at what we know statistically exists as far as percentages of students who might have a mental illness. And when we better understand things like actual facts from experts around this area, when we understand what the statistics look like as far as how many children truly have something that's called a mental illness or mental health disorder, then it starts to shape and shift the conversations that we have. When we understand things like that only approximately about 10% of children 3 to 17 years old have anxiety, it allows us to start shifting the conversations that we are having right now in schools and in society around anxiety in particular. So being grounded in fact, being grounded in actual research and what we know can help to address not just stigma, but how we discuss these things in schools. And by the way, it typically goes without saying, but I am going to say it. It is not our role in schools to diagnose children. That's not our roles. Now, while we have multidisciplinary evaluation processes, those processes are based on whether a child has some disability that might be interfering with adequate academic progress. And so it is not our role to diagnose. So we should never even get to the point of misdiagnosis, because we shouldn't be diagnosing to begin with. Unfortunately, I think what happens is, because of personal experience, because what we read in headlines, because of bits and pieces of what we might hear from non-experts, we might think we know more than what we actually know. Or many times, because of those things, we might think we know things and we're actually wrong about those things. So all of those things can lean into stigma regarding mental health and how we discuss it in schools.
So considering the stigma surrounding mental health literacy and even the stereotypes and biases individuals may develop, what harmful phrases and attitudes perpetuate misunderstanding around mental health literacy? How can misinformation impact school climate and student safety? And what are some strategies that schools can use to combat the lack of mental health literacy and replace it with evidence-based understanding?
Oh, there's so much in that question. I want to first focus on the phrases that perpetuate stigma. Like, what are the stigmatizing labels? Participated in many, many trainings where we get people to think about all of the phrases or statements like crazy, insane, psycho, loony, attention-seeking, weak, spaz. But I also think, we inadvertently use language like, well, that's my OCD coming out when I'm very organized about my desk. Or the weather is just so bipolar today. Or that bipolar kid. I think, we really have to train ourselves and the people that we work with to use person-centered language, which is, it's not that bipolar kid, it's that child with a bipolar disorder. Or, that addict. This is a person who's really struggling with substance use. And I think the other thing that happens often is we minimize what people are going through in an effort to try and dismiss it, because then we don't have to deal with it. And then I think we tend sometimes to blame people for the things that they're experiencing. What do you have to be depressed about? You haven't been on the planet long enough. Or, you're just looking for an excuse to get out of work. Or my very favorite one is, the tough love. If we just get tough with substance use or get tough with absenteeism that's coming from school refusal, then everybody will turn around. And I think that just really feeds into that lack of ability to recognize that help seeking is really a positive thing. I'm reminded of what Mr. Rogers said. He said, what is speakable is manageable. And, going back to that time and time again and helping kids recognize that, this is a brain issue is really important. So that culture of openness.
So from where I sit, I think and believe and know that the most harmful phrases that are currently being used in K-12 situations and labeling is taking words like anxiety, taking words like depression, and applying it to all experiences that children and adolescents have. Anxiety and depression have very specific meanings. And when we apply the terms, that child has anxiety, oh, they all have anxiety, oh, we have a mental health crisis, all these kids have anxiety now, it dilutes the meaning so much that, again, nobody knows what each other is saying. And because an anxiety disorder means something very specific, when we apply the term anxiety to normal life experiences like worrying about a test coming up, or being nervous right before going on the stage because you're the lead in the school musical, or getting yourself, maybe you feel physical symptoms of being worked up before you have to go to a class you don't like. Not understanding that there is a difference between worry, stress, anxiety, and anxiety disorder becomes very harmful, because ultimately what it means is that children who truly have moved beyond working through the normal life experience of worry that can be very helpful to us, moving past the normal life experience, the physiological experience of stress, moving beyond anxiety, which is a combination of worry and stress. There's a difference between those three things and then a disorder where children get into a place where they can't move beyond worry, stress, and anxiety that can be so positive for us, and it becomes a negative theme. But when we dilute the a term like anxiety that way, I just really feel like in schools it becomes one of the most harmful ways we discuss how a child is progressing as far as their own mental health. So we really have to be very precise in our language. And if we want to lean away from stigma, if we want to lean towards engaging in supportive measures rather than creating more problems than there actually are, then we want to really understand exactly what this language means.
If we're looking at language, specifically looking at anxiety, depression, and how they have lost their meaning in many ways too, like the outlying public, how do some of the lost in translation or loss of language, how is this contributing to stereotyping the students that are in our classrooms? Particularly, I'm even thinking towards, whether it's depression, aggressive behaviors, violence.
It's important for people to understand that, as I said, having anxiety, which is a combination of the cognitive process of worry coupled with the physiological process of stress response, having that occur to us is a very, very much part of the human experience. It's a natural part of the human experience. Being mad about something is part of the human experience. And where things go off track sometimes is whenever we have these typical experiences and they then move into behaviors that look and that don't look pro-social. Things like children engaging in acts of aggression or violence. And so it's important to delineate and tease out the differences between that. And even then, if a child or adolescent engages in behaviors or truly has a mental illness, we need to understand that they aren't stuck there forever. They can move, and we can help them move more towards wellness and further away from struggle and unwellness.
I think that, picking up on what you just said, the most important thing that an educator can do is build hope. And I don't mean, pie in the sky, everything's rosy, but real solid hope that you're not in this alone. We're going to figure this out. There are a lot of resources that we can put in place to help you learn to manage this. When I did treatment for part of my career, one of the things that we would say to people all the time is, you didn't cause this, but it's your responsibility to learn how to manage it, whether that was a major depressive episode or a cannabis use disorder. And so I think that the hope is, yes, we can learn to manage that, and you're not in this alone, and we're going to keep working to figure it out. I think the other thing, Melissa, that you said that I want to pick back up on is really stressing again to educators that you are not the one who's going to be teasing this out. However, you do need some assistance in the classroom to help support that child in managing behaviors that are getting in their way of learning and maybe in everybody else's. And I think one watchword that we try to teach in terms of mental health literacy all the time is, you go back to frequency, intensity, duration. And how often do you see this? How long has this gone on? But the real sweet spot is how much does this interfere with this child's ability to do what we expect them to do on a daily basis, and how much does it impact others, whether that's in the classroom or at home or in the community. And I think part of mental health literacy is learning not to be afraid to ask the hard questions. You seem really down lately. I'm worried about you. There's some big changes that I'm seeing. What's going on? How can I help? And really extending that is really a powerful message of hope, because it opens a window for communication and understanding, and helping people recognize that these are brain challenges. They are not willful or negative behaviors that are coming from evil.
So as we transition from social emotional learning into social emotional wellness in our efforts to teach and to support the whole child, what role does SEW play in building a strong common language around mental health literacy? How can our schools train staff and students to use that language that promotes well-being rather than reinforcing stereotypes? And how can our leaders integrate mental health literacy into daily practices and policies?
Well, first of all, I think we have to start with empathy and encourage our students and staff to consider this perspective of someone who's struggling with a mental health challenge. And I think correcting misinformation, challenging harmful stereotypes and myths. When we hear someone say, oh, that kid's crazy, let me help you reframe that. That child is really struggling. Teaching students and staff what correct and respectful terms are for mental health conditions. And, that culture of openness, that we discuss mental health, it's not only supported, but it's encouraged and it's acceptable. Because at one point or another, all of us struggle either with big A anxiety, as Melissa talked about, the diagnostic category, but we all struggle with little a anxiety or little d depression, and we can all support each other by being open about some of those things.
What I am most excited about in the field around SEL and SEW is that we've taken the foundation for years now around really developing what is social and emotional learning, and now we've shifted to social and emotional learning in action when we talk about social and emotional wellness. You can't get to wellness before you understand what we're talking about, which is what we've been spending years doing right now, is really giving that baseline literacy of what does it look like, what are the skills and competencies that are required for a child, for an adolescent to successfully navigate the world in a positive way from a social and emotional standpoint. And now we're saying, okay, now that we have that understanding, that baseline knowledge, now let's really put that all into action and move towards wellness. And also understand that we can't all, just like no one, even if they have a diagnosis, a mental illness diagnosis, that doesn't mean that forever and ever you are stuck at being unwell. And on the opposite, what it also means is we aren't always every day showing up socially and emotionally well. And so we want to be developing skills and competencies to get as close to being well as possible. And so really, when you ask how schools can train staff and students to use that language that promotes well-being, it started years ago when we started talking about social and emotional learning. And what we can do is know, as Susan has said, nobody is in this alone. We're all in this together. So if it seems like we're moving away or moving towards stereotypes or stigmatizing language, that we remind each other how to get back on track with person-centered language, with acknowledging people, with being compassionate towards people, with what they're going through in their lives. And the last comment I'll have on that, especially around stereotypes and the language we use, we do all need to hold each other to a higher standard, no matter what language is being used in the world at this point by influencers in the world. Because we are starting to take some steps backward in some of these areas with language that influencers are using that are incredibly stigmatizing and lead into a lot of stereotypes. So as educators, I would ask all of my colleagues that we hold each other to a higher standard and make sure that no matter how powerful a quote-unquote influencer is in society, that we hold ourselves to a different kind of standard and make sure that we're using language that is supportive of children and whatever kinds of experiences they are, whether it's a child who has an intellectual disability, whether it's a child who has an anxiety disorder or bipolar disorder. We want to make sure as educators that we're using appropriate language that's not stigmatizing and doesn't take us backwards in time.
Now, in recent years, there has been an increased amount of training mandates, whether it's been in safety and security, pushing towards trauma-informed care, and other areas falling under mental health. There's also a new encouragement for our educators to receive SAP training, or perhaps for those that were trained years ago to have refresher courses so that they can connect with some of the current trends that we're seeing in the classrooms. So what role does professional development and partnerships with mental health professionals play in helping schools understand, apply, and create supportive learning environments focused on mental health literacy?
I think it's interesting that you would use professional development as one hand, but also partnerships, community partnerships in the other, because they go together. I think building a strong student assistance program or system that has aligned with multi-tiered systems of support is our best approach, because one of the things that's unique about Pennsylvania student assistance is we have, serving many, if not most schools, someone called a SAP liaison who comes from a community agency that has advanced expertise in mental health and substance use issues. Many have come from treatment. Many are very well trained in screening and assessment. They provide technical support to educational teams of educators in the building who really depend on frontline staff, students, parents to identify early some of the learning barriers that could indicate an underlying behavioral health issue. Doesn't mean that it does. And to go back to Melissa's point, it's a continuum, isn't it? And so we don't diagnose, we don't treat, and we really do honor confidentiality. So I think the first part is not only having that SAP liaison there, but that SAP liaison at the table is able to connect students and families with the best resources in the community. So that's one hand. I think the other hand, in terms of professional development, is that has to start with onboarding for new staff. It has to really include yearly in-servicing for staff and doing some deep dives so that they can recognize that behaviors aren't willful, but that they really are an iceberg And underneath that iceberg of what we see, there's so many reasons for the behaviors that maybe are creating concern.
When I think about Dr. Kuchar again, who, so much wonderful work has come from, and I think about, as Susan has said, how these two, professional development and partnerships, go hand in hand. I think about somebody like Dr. Kuchar, who's a psychiatrist by background. So he's medically trained. He is diagnostic in his thinking, in his training. When he has systems, frameworks like the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders. He has other kind of medical coding checklists that are done to think about whether a child is meeting criteria for a mental health disorder or not. And he's taken that background and he has applied that to the context of schools using our language. The best professional development that I've seen that is a collaboration between schools and community providers, people who are clinical experts, have been when people from schools and those clinical providers sit down together and better understand each other's systems and better understand each other's language. That's how these two things go really together well. When I've seen professional development that has been given by people with a clinical background, and that step has been skipped of sitting down and understanding each other, what happens is we start talking around each other, through each other, we don't see or hear each other. And so we might get a clinician come in and talk about mental health, the mental health crisis in schools, and a clinician walks in and starts telling educators all of the criteria that have to be met for a child to meet an anxiety disorder. And at that point, then what we see is an auditorium shut down, and educators, their eyes glass over because they either don't know the language or they say, what's this got to do with me? It's not my job to be a psychiatrist or a clinical psychologist. So these two things, professional development and partnerships with mental health professionals, really do go hand in hand. And it has to be a balance with each other where we sit down, we understand each other and where we're coming from better, and then take expertise from both of those places and put them together to help people in schools better understand what they're seeing, what children are experiencing, so that we can provide a more supportive learning environment.
And one of the things that I hear time and time again in my work in student assistance is, if you talk to the average classroom teacher, they get upset because the SAP team doesn't share all of the information that they've gathered with them, because they need to know diagnoses and family dynamics in order to truly work with that student. And I come back very gently with, I disagree wholeheartedly. You need to learn how to manage what you're seeing in the classroom, and that's where you need the support. But if we give you that information, and you might be someone who really handles that with great care and confidentiality, someone else may not. And so that really then leads to a climate where it's really not safe to talk about these things. So I want teachers to hear that they don't need to know all of the nitty-gritty, gory details about a student's story in order to be able to support their learning in positive ways. And so that confidentiality issue is really key.
I agree. The teacher's lounge should not be a place of gossip for our individual students' mental health.
Dynamite them.
And my experiences are laying within the Tri-County area that I'm currently working in, but I do get to see a wide variety of districts and systems. Mm-hmm. And considering that your outreach is even greater than mine in terms of systems, schools, districts, how have you seen buildings and or districts themselves really successfully build a culture of mental health literacy?
I would answer that question from the highest level of the system, which is that there are schools and districts across this entire state who are engaging in excellent examples of supportive environments for students who are both struggling and students who are doing well around mental health issues. And the reason one of the big reasons I believe this is happening started, long ago when we were first addressing things like bullying prevention, when Act 71 came about in 2014, and we became more aware of suicide, how to prevent it, how to be aware of things like warning signs of suicide, how to intervene when we have students who are struggling, moving towards a future when we had to make sure that we were trauma sensitive and trauma informed in our schools, moving towards mandating behavior threat assessment teams in all schools, towards where we are now with Act 55 that's requiring every single adult on the payroll of school systems knowing more about mental health, being more literate. And so while I have had, it's been such an honor and privilege to travel all over the state, really literally every corner of the state and everywhere in between. As my mechanic told me, I traveled 50,000 miles in the state of Pennsylvania last year. I've hit every corner. I have seen extraordinary work going on everywhere that is supported by the mandates that we have from the legislation. It has been supported by grant funding that we've been provided with by the government entities like Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency. So I'm seeing successes all over the state in all of those areas that I mentioned. That's one big component. And the other component is it has been rare for me to meet a adult in a school system yet. And I have met tens of thousands of adults in school systems in the state of Pennsylvania. It has been rare to meet somebody who just intrinsically, that just doesn't have it in themselves to want to do better. And what I found is that the majority of adults in schools, when they're being vulnerable, when they're being honest, they'll say, look, I know I don't know this stuff, but I want to know this stuff, and I want to do better. And that's why I really believe that the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is one of the leaders in the country in this space, is that we have schools and districts all over the state who are either in a place of incredible maturity and iterative improvements, that in all of those areas I mentioned, suicide prevention, behavior threat assessment teams, mental health literacy, bullying prevention, are doing wonderful jobs, or people who are just iteratively getting better in one or two of those places. And a lot of that just has to do with, it's who we are as educators. We want to help children. Sometimes we just need to be taught a little bit more.
So, as districts begin to lead these initiatives towards improving mental health literacy and developing a common language amongst their stakeholders, where should they begin? What advice do you have for our administrators that are beginning this process within their own school buildings?
You have to look to the resources, the no-cost resources. Because when I talk to people about resources, I always talk about no-cost resources. Whether people are more literate around mental health in schools, whether schools are more safe and secure, should not be dictated by how much money you have in a line item. So I'll talk about no-cost resources. No-cost resources that are evidence-based, that have been developed by subject matter experts, by subject matter consultants. In the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, we are so lucky to have so many resources. When you look at the Act 55 requirements that I mentioned, that a whole team of subject matter consultants and experts worked together to create all different types of resources to help people understand more about trauma in children and adolescents, to help them understand behavioral health more, to help them be more situationally aware, to help them understand substance use more, to understand suicide and bullying prevention and awareness more. You can look to resources like that, and Shannon will be dropping those resources on the page too for them to look at PAK12SSSTP.org/training. That's a mouthful.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we'll make sure we drop that in for you. So whether you're looking at resources like that or going to Dr. Stan Kuchar's group from the University of British Columbia, where entire curriculums have been created, evidence-based curriculums that were created, by the way, for educators in all of the provinces in Canada, but that are applicable to any educator in the United States. Learn mental health literacy at the University of British Columbia and teach mental health literacy for children and adolescents are curriculums that are evidence-based that can be used to help improve mental health literacy in schools, not just for the adults, but also for the children and adolescents in schools.
I'm going to go in a different direction and suggest that leaders really take a look and do a good, thorough needs assessment and resource map. A good needs assessment, you can get one for free from the University of Maryland School of Medicine. They have a Center for School Mental Health. They call it the SHAPE system. It's a great resource for really looking at where are our needs and gaps. The other thing then is to really sit down and look at where are those gaps, but also what resources do we have in place. I'm going to go back to how strong and effective is your student assistance team? When were they last trained? There's lots of free training available in the Commonwealth for student assistance from now until the end of 2026. So that training gives 13 Act 48 hours, 14 Act 45 hours, and you're going to want to bookmark pnsas.org. There you can find all kinds of helpful resources on strengthening your student assistance team, as well as providers throughout the Commonwealth that offer a really consistent SAP training. So that's where I go. I think you got to take a look at where your needs are, what you have, and then build it out. I think SAP has to be at the center, and I think we have to give our teams, whether that's SAP or MTSS or the two are aligned, or threat assessment, we have to give these people time to do the work that is so vital to improving achievement and helping kids develop into socially and emotionally well adults.
One other way I'd like people to think about how we can improve mental health literacy in schools, building off of what Susan said, is start with the needs assessment. The other framework that we want to use so that we understand what areas of need we have is by thinking about the 5 areas of emergency operation planning that we have to do in schools. When I'm out working with school leaders, with people who are responsible for everything from emergency operation plans to suicide awareness, prevention, intervention, especially to behavior threat assessment teams, I often remind them that the place that we most overlook increasing mental health literacy and where we prepare for mental health crisis is in the recovery phase of emergency operation planning. And so then when I think about resources in that area, the area where we focus on moving people back towards normalcy once either a child is in crisis or there's been some sort of critical incident, I point people to resources like psychological first aid for schools. Mm-hmm. I point to people to resources like Listen, Protect, Connect, Model, Teach. I especially highlight resources like the STAR Clinic, the Services for Teens at Risk. That's part of University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, where we have some of the best experts in the entire country who focused on postvention. What do we do after an unexpected death? And there's a whole slew of resources there. So we don't want to forget about the fact that a lot of times we engage in mental health literacy from a proactive and preventative standpoint, but we can never discount or make less important all of the planning and all the knowledge we need as far from a mental health literacy perspective in the recovery stage of any kind of critical incident that happens or a child who's struggling.
Wow. That was a powerful conversation exploring mental health literacy, what it is, why it matters, and how schools can't afford to ignore it. So today we unpacked how mental health literacy is more than just awareness. It's about understanding, language, and action. When schools lack this shared understanding, stigma grows, misinformation spreads, and too many students fall through the cracks. But when educators and students are equipped with accurate, compassionate knowledge, the entire school climate shifts, and for the better. We called out some harmful phrases and outdated mindsets that still show up in schools, and we explored how social-emotional wellness, thoughtful language, and strong partnerships with mental health professionals can begin to flip that script. The message is clear. Mental health literacy isn't an add-on. It's foundational to student safety, educator effectiveness, and school success. So if there's one thing to take away from today, it's this. Start the conversation. Train the adults, empower the students, and build a culture where mental health isn't whispered about, but understood, respected, and supported every day. Thanks for tuning in to Lesson Learned, the official podcast of the Curriculum Instruction and Assessment Department at Midwestern Intermediate Unit 4. Until next time, continue to educate, innovate, and inspire. We'll see you again soon.